Good afternoon and welcome to Praxis Peace Institute's Zoom series. I'm Georgia Kelly, the director of Praxis, and today we are very fortunate to host an expert in an area that is dominating our daily news reports. Linda Dittmar was born in New York City, but grew up in Tel Aviv during the early years of Israel's formation. She returned to the US, studying at Stanford University, where she received a BA and PhD degrees in comparative literature. She was also a professor at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where she focused on film as well as literature. She has also taught at the University of Paris, Tel Aviv University, and received 2 Fulbright grants to India. Since becoming Professor Emerita, she has focused on Israel-Palestine, a return to her roots, which led to her excellent book, Tracing Homelands, Israel-Palestine and the Claims of Belonging. I highly recommend this. It not only is a unique accounting of the early days of Israel, but she also examines the propaganda, the myths, the psychology, and trauma that has imbued this region for so many decades. But it's also about discovery and the willingness to learn anew. So welcome, Linda. It's wonderful to have you with us today.
Thank you very much, Georgia. I'm delighted to be here. I'm looking at everybody and feeling I'd like to know you more, but here we are on a Zoom. It's a great honor and an opportunity for me to talk about whatever interests you in relation to that. I can only say that for me personally, it was a very complicated journey from the days of the British Mandate through the War of Independence, as we Israelis call it, or the Nakba, as the Palestinians call it, to the present. And I see more of a continuity from the beginning to now than I'd ever expected, given what's happening now in the Gaza area.
That's
so it's a very difficult topic to talk about, and we have to.
Well, what I would like to do, I want to go into a kind of a wide range of things, and will depend on what people are interested in later. But I do want to tell those of you who haven't been on some of the Praxis programs before, is that we'll spend about a half hour with the interview, and then we're going to open it up to questions from people on the call. And you will be asked to unmute when you're called on, but not before, so that we don't get background noise. So thank you for that. So I'm going to begin, Linda, with a quote from your book, which really struck me. Quote, "My own narrative is about what I knew as a child bystander participant in this momentous history, and about what I learned, unlearned, questioned, and revised as an adult regarding our presence on the land. It entailed a slow and painfully reluctant peeling away of layers of the myths, convictions, and obfuscations that sustain Israel's geopolitical aspirations. In doing so, I came to know my own roots in Israel's early settler colonialism, and to look squarely at its increasingly brutal chokehold over Palestinians' daily lives. So before we launch into some of the history and creation of Israel, I'd like to examine and have you examine for us some of the myths that have permeated Zionism and that fuels a lot of the war that we've seen in the region in previous decades and especially today. But I think it's important for people to understand how these myths determine policy and what the psychology is with them. So could you enlighten us a bit about that?
Well, in my experience and reading as well, myths always have some anchor in truth. They are not simply lies or alternative facts. There's always a complication in a myth. And the ones that I'm sure many of you know and have heard before is the myth of a land without people to a people without land. That was very prevalent belief in Europe at the time, way back. The myth also of making the desert bloom. These are cornerstones of Zionist belief about Israel. And they are not entirely wrong, and they are also greatly wrong at the same time. So I think those two myths are particularly important because they, out of that unfolds everything else in a way. They are a key. The idea of a people without land, and the other one also I would add is the land of our forefathers, which again raises the question of how far does a people go to claim that that is their heritage? Because everywhere we are, including in California and in the United States, there were other people before. Sometimes there are remnants of them still around, sometimes totally gone. And certainly in Israel, you can see on the Holy Land, you can see layers and layers and layers of conquest. And the land belonged to many different people at many different times. Some of them are now extinct as a people. But who are our forefathers, and how you believe that it is ours? Or the other notion, which I don't know if to call religion a myth exactly, but that God promised it to us and therefore it's ours, is another one that's in debate. So the whole issue of ownership of that land is a question. The reality was that there were people living there. It was not a land without people. And the Jews were not always people without land. They may not have a national land. They may have been scattered around the world, but they were not landless people in the way that some of the migrant groups today are. The Jews were sometimes migrant and without land, and sometimes settled in many different countries, including in Africa, in Asia, and in Europe, and in the New World as well. So the land without people is another one. And then the issue of the desert blooming, the reality is that the Palestinians did farm that land. It was not a desert at the time. They farmed it in a different system than we are used to, because they did not have the technology to shift water the way we did. And they didn't have the plows or tractors that we had and so on. But they were farming and living on that land. So actually, when you look at archival photographs of that area, you see that there are very few trees around. And that is true. And that is because over wars, the land was decimated, most recently by the Ottomans, but repeatedly the trees were cut down, and it's not a country that has abundant rains, so it's not easy for trees to come back there. But it was not a desert. It really wasn't.
That's
So
interesting.
these are key myths, not all, but key of them.
And there's another one which maybe we can get to later about the sense of persecution.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, right. Do you want to say anything about
I
that
mean,
first?
well, I just want to say that persecution is there, and that's not a myth. The problem is how it's being interpreted by the Jewish population, or in the diaspora and in Israel. The question that comes close to being maybe a prediction more than a myth is the sense that that will keep happening to us over and over and over again, not only in the past, but in the future. So that becomes a justification for militarism in Israel specifically, and the fighting in Gaza, among other things.
Okay, now I'd like
But
to,
there has been, yeah, go ahead, sorry.
I just wanted to go back into some of the history because, and I don't know a lot about this at all. So I'm really asking you to enlighten me as well as the rest of us about some of the history of the Jewish people and the Palestinians during the Ottoman Empire, because it looked like this was a period of peace between the two groups, and it was a 400-year era. So I want you to explain something about how this peace was destroyed with the end of the Ottoman Empire, what the relevance is of the Balfour Declaration, which really came from or devised by the British, and how this set things in motion for where we are today even.
Yeah, so I want to mention that my own family arrived in Palestine, in Ottoman Palestine in the 1880s. So we were part of what was considered the first Aliyah to the country, and that was under the Ottoman period. And while it was definitely a peaceful time, and the Jewish immigrants, a very small number of them, mainly helped by the Rothschild at the time, were able to buy land, often from absentee land owners, not from an immediate settler, peasant Palestinians, but from absentee landlords, and lived relatively peacefully next to one another. I'm saying relatively because the Jewish population then was tiny. It did not disturb most of the Palestinian who lived there at the time, except that even the village that my own family moved into and bought the land, and that is the village of Metula, that is on the way up the Lebanese border, 600 Druze people were dispossessed legally because the land was bought, but nonetheless they were dispossessed. And that question was happening early on at a time when the Jewish settling was so small that the disturbances were relatively limited. But actually, my own family did have to evacuate their village several times over under attack. What I believed for many, many years was the attacks were by Arabs who hated us Jews and wanted us away from there. What I learned later was that partly it was by the Druze people who were dispossessed immediately by us. And then a financial settlement was arranged with them and it quietened down. But meanwhile, there was fighting happened in the neighboring Lebanon and Syria against the French that began after the British and French partition or allocation of that land during the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And that happened shortly after World War I, as the Turks lost the area to the Western powers, to Britain and France in particular. The British and French made an agreement that the French will get Syria and Lebanon, and the British will get Palestine. The British also got Iraq, as you may know. But anyway, that was, the assumption by foreign conquerors that they will draw borders and say, you take this part and I'll take that part, is in retrospect amazing, but that is what happened. And then under the British, until more or less World War II, there was a continuing push by Jewish population to come to British Palestine. And the push was entirely almost from Russia and the Ukraine, because there were terrible pogroms happening against the Jews at that time. And really, when we think about Zionism nowadays, everybody tends to, or many people ascribe it to World War II. But actually, we really need to ascribe it at the very least to the pogroms that were happening in Eastern Europe, and also to the Dreyfus trial in France that alerted people to the extent of anti-Semitism in France and in the West. And these are very important beginnings that antedate the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And if you want to go just a little bit further back, I think it makes sense also to go to the Napoleonic Wars, where all of Europe was in turmoil, but it created the rise of what nowadays we think of as modern nationalism. It was a time when Italy became a country rather than a bunch of dukedoms. Germany became a country. France became a country a little earlier, but Yugoslavia emerged eventually as a country. There was a rise of nationalism around the Western world and a tiny bit even in the Arab world. And it made sense for the Jews to think, we will go to the land of our forefathers and become a nation like other nations, essentially. So Zionism really got a very major push before the Holocaust, including the fact that the first Hebrew language novel was published in the middle of the 19th century, which means that there was also at that point a revival, a national revival of the Hebrew language that was emerging as part of the rise of nationalism. Until then, Hebrew was only used for secular purposes. I mean, for religious purposes. So, that is what led to the Holocaust. And then after the Holocaust, there was, of course, a huge wave of dispossessed Jews, At that time, it were indeed people without land. And the reality is that the West, including the United States, did not want to accept them. There was nowhere to send them, and they went to the Holy Land. They went to Palestine. And then there was a war with the Palestinians and so on. But that is kind of the history, and I think it's an important history. I think that basically Israel was created by the West over time, by
That,
Western politics.
that's a very interesting point, Linda, and it was one that I did want to get to, is how this all originated, what some of the backdrop was in the last few centuries. And yesterday, when you and I spoke, you talked about the impact on the Palestinian population that has been forced off their land, not only in the creation of Israel, but also how the settler strategy has continued since that time. And I think this is important to look at what's happened in the past several decades, with Palestinians being forced off land, their houses bulldozed. I'm sure you remember even Rachel Corrie, who was an American, was killed by one of those bulldozers as she tried to protect some Palestinian homes. And you mentioned in the book something interesting, that even the faculty club at Tel Aviv University was once a grand Palestinian home.
Yeah.
So one has to ask, why wouldn't one expect a backlash, even a violent one, to this kind of land grab and violence? And I want to kind of look at this from both places here. It seems like a backlash is inevitable with this sort of move for the past several decades. And I think it is probably what helped the formation of Hamas, which has been horrible. But I'd like you to comment a little bit about what has happened to the Palestinians through the settler process in the last several decades.
Well, I began by talking about my family's village, Metula, and that is just an example of what happened in various places around the country. And at the time, it was on a very small scale and done legally, in the sense that the land was bought and given to certain Jewish settlers. So, that's, it's hard to argue with the legal purchase, other, excuse me, other than to say who was selling the land. How could they even think of selling it in that way from under the peasants who were living in that land? I also should mention that there were cities, Jaffa, Haifa, of course, Jerusalem, Safed, they were all mixed populations at one time or another in different ways. But the problem from the Palestinian point of view kept getting more and more acute as more and more Jews were coming in. And while it was continuing in the beginning, definitely to be legal in that sense, and we all know that laws are always designed to benefit some people, not necessarily to benefit everybody. But it became acute because more and more Jews were coming in, needing to come in. And essentially, Europe was pushing them there. I don't know what else to say about that other than, the two groups became increasingly anxious about that. Some of you may know that early settler Zionism in Israel was actually very socialist, and there was even a very strong communist party that was pro-Russia at the time, Jewish. And that was another issue, that the Jewish labor unions would not accept any Palestinians at the time into the unions. So there were two tiers of workers: those who could bargain, and there were many wonderful cooperatives, Jewish cooperatives, cooperative factories, cooperative farms, cooperative kibbutzim, all kinds, which were really in some way utopian, but utopian only for ourselves. The Palestinians were left out of it and were relatively in the position of the cheap labor and the rejected labor, or the kind of people you go to when there's nobody else to do the work. So there was already enmity happening at that time, as well as the Palestinians seeing us increasingly building, increasingly flourishing in a way that was prevented from them in various historical reasons, including their oppression under the Turks and the British, which just didn't allow them to develop the way the Israelis were able. We were European. We were, so to speak, white. I mean, a certain racism is part of what is going on, as well as disrespect for Islam. You know, the Christians, the Palestinian Christians did better than the Palestinian Muslims. You know, there were all these divisions that were happening there. And then the Holocaust happened. And what could the world do except allow the refugees to come to Israel? And I can't tell you how awful it was when we were swamped by these people, what terrible shape they were in. You know, you kept seeing people with the camp numbers tattooed on their hands, hollowed eyes, you know, many of them deeply traumatized, living in terrible condition until eventually we were able to house them properly. I mean, they were in horrible condition. And somehow we had to do something about them. The issue that I'm writing in my book about is it's very understandable that we will want to take care of our own. It is less humanly common that people will have similar empathy for the suffering of the other people. I mean, the people who came to Israel were, in a way, our family. It could have been us. Everyone with a number on the hand could have been me or my parents. But they were the other, and we did not think about them in the same way. And we were completely content to expel them in a huge number out of the country without thinking about it, because we needed the country and we wanted it for ourselves. Now, another myth about that is, of course, you know, the UN had a partition plan, and Israel accepted the partition plan, but it was attacked by all the surrounding Arab armies. Another myth that is true. They attacked us, there's no question. But when you look about who those they were, who were the army of Syria, the army of Lebanon, the army of Egypt, I mean, they were in such terrible shape themselves and so uninvested in fighting us that they had no chance against us. And I did not mention Jordan on purpose, because Jordan was the only one that had a really strong army and were trained by the British at the time, under King Abdallah and then King Hussein. But they were alone, and they ultimately made a deal with Israel, with us during the war, and they did not fight hard. So you know, that was the war, and we basically expelled about 750,000 Palestinians from the country. And I'm saying about because numbers vary, and this is sort of the most often cited one, but there may be a few more or a few less. And we destroyed around 450 villages in the process. And there's plenty of documentation on that. This is not an alternative fact.
I think it's very important to get that kind of documentation. So I appreciate and the fact that we're recording this as well. Today, I noticed in the paper, Oxfam Middle East Director Sally Khalil said that, quote, "The scale and atrocities that Israel is visiting upon Gaza are truly shocking. For 100 days, the people of Gaza have endured a living hell. Nowhere is safe, and the entire population is at risk of famine." And it goes on to say, that's the end of the quote, that Israel has killed more people per day in its attack on Gaza than were killed daily in any other major conflict in this 21st century. And I wanted to ask you about, I mean, there's a lot of protests pushing for a ceasefire, and yet we have our government pushing for more war. And we feel like we're up against something we have no control over. And I think most of us do want a ceasefire. What do you see as our role, or is there anything we can do in helping to get this war stopped? Have a ceasefire, have some kind of negotiations. Are we past the ability to be able to do that? What is your opinion?
I think it would take a lot of courage from the government to change its current policy. I think it's a very dangerous moment for the United States, because there are a lot of voters for the Democratic Party who are disaffected at the moment. a lot of young people because of this issue, and I gather that the Black population for other issues. But the question is, would the government be willing to change course at this point, very, very close to elections? And I'm not sure. I just want to say, I'm not a political scientist, but at least what I do know is that the American government was qualified about the Middle East from the get-go. As a matter of fact, around after World War II, for a while, the United States almost backed away from the partition, from something that I read. And the people who supported Israel most at the time were the Soviet Union, actually. And then the United States discovered that Israel is more pro-Western, and therefore we became close with the United States. But I think from the get-go, the CIA and the State Department had trouble dealing with Israel, knowing what to do. We were such a clear ally for them. We were an asset. And I want to say that to my mind, it actually served what they thought was American interest to keep a Middle East tension simmering as a very, very low level, not war, but conflict, because we were helpful with information, intelligence for the CIA, and also we were helpful in the jiggling of alliances, who's going to be allied with whom, all that diplomacy. We were part of that. And we were a very good pawn in that game, actually. And now it's backfiring, what they call a blowback. It's, just as Iran is a blowback also, that the CIA played its card too cleverly in Iran, and now Iran is a problem. The same happened, I think, throughout the Middle East. We were not handled well. So what can the government do today? I really don't know. I don't imagine the government taking a brave step forward. There is an issue of who contributes money. How do the Democrats look next to the Republicans? Certainly the Republicans wouldn't help in this situation. And the Democrats are really in a bind, as far as I can say. So I'm glad I'm not an advisor to Biden, because it would be a very hard thing what to say to him at the moment. He is in really terrible shape. But I think that there's a long history that led us to that, a long set of mistakes along the way. And there were plenty of opportunities in much less contentious times for the American government to step in and say, we are going to cut back some of the aid unless you really talk and come to an agreement. And we didn't. We didn't want it. And I'm not sure the Palestinians wanted it either. So it had to be forced, and it wasn't.
It has to be forced from the outside. The other worry, and I'm going to open it up to the audience shortly to ask questions. The other worry that has just really emerged in the last few days is the escalation of the war into other parts of the Middle East. Yemen, Iran, Jordan. I mean, it's looking very serious at this point as to where this could go. And I think something needs to happen or needs to be negotiated before this escalates beyond what is controllable.
Yeah.
So I think I will open it up to questions. I see Howard has his hand up. Howard, would you like to go ahead? You can unmute.
All right, thank you for the presentation. I was sufficiently impressed after the 5-minute mark that I did divert and order your book online. But nonetheless, my question is this. A dear friend of mine was one of the principal lobbyists for AIPAC. His name was Gideon Gorin. And Gideon and I would used to argue with great animation, with great spirit, and casual onlookers would think that we were going to kill one another. And we would argue over his positions via AIPAC, and his justification seemed to always boil down to, they have vowed to exterminate us. We have no other choice.
Yeah.
Well, if that's true, I never did accept his argument, but nonetheless, if that is true, what is the ultimate solution? Do we wait for some other climate change to just solve the problem for us in 100 years, or what do we do?
Yeah, I sometimes joke very cynically that if we wait long enough, China will solve the problem for us. But I really feel they did not vow to exterminate us. The Hamas did, but they, in the broad sense of humanity or the Christian world or the anti-Semites or whatever, never vowed to exterminate us. What we've been doing in our own Passover Haggadah that we read every year, the traditional saying in it is, they came against us in one generation after another to destroy us. We say it about our place. Nobody said it about us. Except, yeah, the Nazis wanted to destroy us. Hamas wants not only to destroy Israel and the Jews, they want to destroy all infidels, the same way that ISIS dreamt of doing. But that's a different kind of a weird pathology in certain people. It's not the world. I really think that your friend has it wrong. I would add that Netanyahu's father, Ben Zion Netanyahu, his whole understanding of Jewish history, going back to the Spanish Inquisition, was precisely one that believed that every generation somebody will come to destroy us. That's why we need our own state. And that is, I think, what your friend believes too, except he thinks that people vow to do that. I never heard of that. That's all I can say.
You know, I just read recently too that $58 million went toward Congress people running for re-election from AIPAC. So this is a serious buying off of candidates to support war. And of course, it's nothing new. It happens with a lot of our wars from the military industrial corporations. Do we have any more questions coming up? Hopefully. Want more questions?
I do want to say, kind of for AIPAC, is that they believe that they are protecting Israel. You know, they're not for war per se, they want to protect Israel. However, the way Israel defines its protection is through war. Israel has always been a fortified country, essentially. And the Jews who support it have no choice but support it on its terms. So AIPAC is kind of drawn, I'm not thinking of AIPAC as essentially warmongers so much as people who want to support Israel and have the power, the political power and the money to do so.
Okay, since Howard's got his hand up again and no one else does, I'm going to call on you again.
Well, if I do this twice in a row, then that will encourage someone else to ask questions just to keep me quiet. But until they do, another source of contention between Gideon and myself, I used to tell him that AIPAC and the AIPAC group, that they were courting danger and it would come back to bite them when they were courting the evangelical wing of the American political right.
Yeah.
And as I look at it, and I look at what the Republicans are doing and the evangelicals and the Trumpites and the MAGites and so on and so forth, Gideon passed away, so I won't be able to say I was right. But I think I was right. What's your feeling on that?
No, you are right. That's my feeling. I agree. But one of the interesting and important phenomena is that Gideon's children and grandchildren, or other people in AIPAC, not necessarily in his family, are raising questions that the older generation is not. And you know, in one of the readings that I gave of my book, a young woman came and bought a copy afterwards and said, I'm buying it for my grandfather. And the reality is that there are disagreements now in families at the dinner table, on Thanksgiving, and so on, because the young people are looking at differently than their grandparents or parents even. And again, I have to say with some empathy for the Gideon generation, that they all experienced the Holocaust. Not maybe directly, but they lived during that time. I lived during that time. And their notion of Zionism is deeply marred by a sense of danger. And we have to acknowledge there is anti-Semitism in America today. It's not totally gone. So their anxiety is justified. The only question is, what do we do about it? How do we handle it? And so, I'm very angry with IPAC, and there's no question about it. I don't know Gideon personally, but the idea, the organization, I'm completely critical of it. But I feel like we need to understand where they're coming from. And in fact, that is sort of the point of my book. At one point, I was asked by somebody why I'm doing what I'm doing. And I said that I'm thinking about it very much in the South African model of truth and reconciliation, that we need to acknowledge each other's pain and need to acknowledge the damage that was done to one another if we are ever to have peace. Otherwise, we'll continue fighting. And right now, Israel is stronger, and the statistics that Georgia quoted will continue, or at some point everybody will collapse with fatigue or something, but that's not a solution, because we are bringing up a new young generation of Palestinians who have all reason to hate us. And we are bringing home Israeli soldiers who are also traumatized. So, it is a poisonous situation. And yes, Howard, you were right. It's a bad road to take.
Yeah, and then you mentioned the truth and reconciliation process, which has really been helpful in many, many situations, and probably eventually could be so useful there. Bob, you've got your hand up, so I'm calling on you.
Yeah, thank you. At a recent discussion of this group, we were talking about this dilemma, and I posed a counterfactual replay of the 20th century in which World War I doesn't occur, and which will very likely, possibly, not likely, but possibly could have reshaped the revolution in Russia. Possibly might not have even happened.
Yeah.
Very likely wouldn't, and therefore would not have happened also World War II, or at least the formation of reconstitution of Germany in the 30s and the 40s, the way it happened, which might have foregone the annihilation of the Jewish population in the German states in World War II, which might have foregone the formation of a land, a Jewish state. Now, certainly, as you pointed out, back through history for a long time, there have been pogroms and displacements and atrocities against Jewish populations in various countries for time at different levels. But nevertheless, the formation of the Jewish state resulted very directly from the political and outfall of World War II. Can you imagine where we would be if that had happened? Vis-a-vis the Jewish population, the Jewish history.
It's a lovely story. I would have loved, it's like taking a movie and reeling it backwards in a way, a really wonderful notion that I love. I can't say for sure, but it seems to me, if as modernity evolved in the 20th century, that the notion, first of all, of religion around the Western world became much more diluted, to say the least, and that nationalism, that is the key in a way, whether nationalism would have remained or whether we had moved to a more fluid world where people could have moved from one place to another. I don't know that. I think nationalism is a very major problem. If you think of just a country like Hungary, for example, that has gone so terribly right-wing in recent years, it is because they tried to create suddenly a truly Magyar nation without all the other non-Jewish minorities that were living in Hungary and are now kind of contained and no immigrants and so on. Now we are in a world where we have a lot of global warming, and part of the migrations that we see is caused by climate, as well as migrations caused by wars and poverty. So the question, and dictatorships as well. So it's a little bit hard to say, but the utopian idea that I would have is, yes, all those wars didn't happen and life would be easy and tolerant. And I think that with tolerance and the decline of religious extremism, that Jews would be tempted to assimilate. I mean, my husband was not Jewish. My son is Jewish just because he has a Jewish mother, and his wife is not Jewish, even though she has a Jewish father, because her mother wasn't Jewish. There's so many young people in the United States now, and you may know some of them, who come already from mixed families. And I think that the mixture was possible because when there is tolerance and openness, sticking to your own kind becomes less important. Is it really important to be Irish, American? Is it really so important to be Greek American? Yes, some people go back to Greece and build a summer house in Greece and go periodically back, but gradually we become something else. And I think that with time and no wars, I don't quite imagine. I think there would be still some people who embrace the particular notion of religion that Judaism has given us because it's attractive in many ways and interesting, as is Coptic Christianity, for example, or the Druze version of non-Islam, but some heresy out of Islam. And there was heresies against Catholicism in Europe in the Middle Ages too. I mean, there were these possibilities, and each one was thwarted politically, basically.
Wanted to ask you, since we don't have anyone putting their hand up at the moment, how you view a two-state solution.
I would be happy with either two-state or one state. I think that the two-state makes a lot of sense provisionally and temporarily because the anger and separation are so intense that I can't see us easily sliding into a one-state, kumbaya together, essentially. But I think ideally, what I envision, and one Israeli politician suggested that his name was Uri Avneri, he suggested that there would be two states that are federated with one another, so that there would be certain sharing, maybe of certain resources, roads, electricity and water, access to airports, all kinds of things that you need for commercial and daily life, a federation. Why not share medical resources with one another, even if we have two separate states, like maybe California and Texas or something, so California and Oregon. But the idea of two states that are federated seems to me a very, very good in-between idea. I think that we are very tiny and space is very short, and that we could move into a one state eventually. We have a lot in common culturally. More and more as the time goes, Israel is becoming more and more Middle Eastern. The influence of the European population is declining. The majority of the country is now Jews from the Arab world anyway. So I could see a mixture. Anyway, I do see some hands up now.
Yes, now we've got a whole bunch of hands up as we're coming into the last part of the program. So I'm going to go to Mary.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was interesting because I've been thinking about the two states, and I just wonder if you are aware of two books that were written by Tim Marshall, The Power of Geography and Prisoners of Geography. And his claim is that the geography really determines the politics. And looking at the West Bank and Gaza and the intervening area of Israel, the map of present Israel, to me, does not support a two-state solution. And I was wondering what you would think of a one-state solution where the Palestinians would be essentially reimbursed or paid to become Palestinian citizens in Israel.
I think that the Palestinians anyway need to be compensated or reimbursed or whatever word we want. Some don't even want to come back to Israel. But I think the issue of, I agree with you about the one state. And while I don't know Tim Marshall's book, I've read other ones about other histories as guns, germs, and I forget that one. But anyway, it also talks about geography essentially. And there are others who do that. And I agree, the country is too tiny to ultimately sustain two states. And I think there isn't any need for two states as long as a true, utter equality of the two groups.
Hey, Jerry.
Oh, yeah. Thank you again for your presentation. As far as possibility of one state, isn't the concern of the Israeli Jews that they could cease to be the dominant group?
Yep.
Isn't that a big barrier to a one-state solution?
I agree. It's the same as the American resistance to immigration because we have an Anglo fantasy of the United States. I mean, and the Hungarians don't want to dilute their Magyar identity. Sure, I think the one state means that kind of compromise. And it doesn't prevent Jews from going to synagogue and having community centers and marrying one another and so on, but treating the stranger among them with equal respect.
But I mean, my sense is that Jews around the world, and especially Jews in Israel, would really have a lot of resistance to the demographic changes that would probably occur where non-Jews would become the dominant group.
They will be living as Jews just as they are here in the United States or in Bombay, India, or wherever. Okay, that is how most Jews live.
Yeah, I understand
They're
that.
happy to live, and they're not going to Israel. They want Israel to be their Jewish state while they're living here in California or wherever they are.
But, well, I'll just say one other thing. I know from talking to, Jewish friends and people in my own family, that a lot of Jews around the world feel that the existence of a Jewish state in Israel gives them a certain status that makes it easier for them to live wherever they are.
That's right. And I totally agree. And Israel does give them that. The issue really is that we have to live in a world that people don't need that kind of status.
Ideally, yes.
So here you have a certain level of hidden anti-Semitism as well as explicit. The hidden can be even about our colleagues at work or somebody who kind of secretly and not openly looks down on Jews or whatever. But we are living in a world where there are all these gradations, and the Jews, nonetheless, a large number, like to live in America and not go there. And they want my family to be in the army and risk their own life and kill the people in Gaza on behalf of the Jewish population in America.
That's an interesting point. Julie, you're next. You want to unmute? She disappeared.
Somebody has a hand up.
Okay.
Yeah,
You hear me now?
Bo has been waving his hand for about 15 minutes.
Bob, quiet. Renee, I'm going to go to you because we lost Julie somehow.
Okay.
Okay, so you had mentioned that more and more the world has become very nationalistic and it's all about the nations, and it makes sense. People want to belong to a nation. So why wouldn't you believe that both the Palestinians would like their own nation and the Israelis would like their own nation? And that the second part of that is that Israel was established as a Jewish state, not as an immigrant state like the United States. So I see quite a difference there.
Actually, it was established as an immigrant state, just like the United States. You had the Pilgrims and others gradually come here and dispossess the Native Americans, the indigenous people. And we did the same in our country. And eventually we became a state and you became a state. So actually the parallel is very much there. I missed the first part of your statement, though.
Establishing nations. So why would the Palestinians
Oh, yeah.
want to establish their own nation?
They all want their own nation at the moment.
And why
And
shouldn't that be why shouldn't that be something, if they have leadership that's willing to negotiate to have their own nation, do so? Repeatedly, they have rejected that. So why
Yeah.
shouldn't there be a push to have the Palestinians support their nationhood and reject the focus on elimination of Israel as a nation?
The idea is of two states. That's what you're talking about. However, the Israelis repeatedly undermined the negotiations. And it is really a myth to think that we offered and they rejected. That is something that you need to actually study a little more closely. But that is the claim that the Israeli government propaganda is putting forth. We tried and they said no. The reality is that the kind of trying we did was every time wily and insincere, and was not making it possible for them to accept. Now, they were both people, there's no question, each wants their own nation. And now, when the enmity is particularly virulent, each one wants the whole land for themselves. The Palestinians want all of it, and Israel want all of it. That is what we hear in the slogans in the street at the moment. But we came to that level because of the long and dishonest negotiations that were happening over the last few decades.
Well, I'm going to go to Julie next.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
So we haven't spoken directly about the war and what's going on in Gaza and the conflict there. And I'm wondering, Linda, what you see as the immediate path forward. How do you see this conflict coming to an end eventually?
Well, the immediate path forward is ceasefire. People need to stop killing and talk to one another. Where the talking will go is, I can't say, because right now both sides are hurting and both sides are furious. So it's not a good way to have a conversation. But a ceasefire will at least stop the horror. And it is a horror for both sides, not just for the Palestinians. The numbers are different, but the psychic pain is immense on both sides at the moment. So all I can say for the moment is ceasefire. The issue is really, and that responds to the point that the other speaker raised a minute ago, is whether there is a sincere interest in having negotiations. And that I cannot say. I don't see the sincerity in Israel, and I haven't particularly seen sincerity with the Palestinians either at the moment. And, in a way, I'm not blaming either of them at the moment, because they really, if I were there, I don't know what I would do. I knew somebody, a woman who my age, who was kidnapped. And I also knew a Palestinian journalist who was stuck there. What do we do with all of that? So ceasefire, yes. And then maybe not the United States, but some relatively uninvolved country can step in and help the negotiations. Norway, Denmark, I don't know, somebody else who's really less invested in a way.
That would be really good. I'm going to take Brian. It will be the last question because we're just about at the hour. So go ahead, Brian.
Linda, thanks for your presentation. My question is, given the destruction of Gaza, who do you see rebuilding Gaza, given the immense devastation and destruction?
Yeah, no, that's, who do I see? I don't see Israel rebuilding Gaza. I don't see Egypt rebuilding it. I don't know what will happen to the people of Gaza. Israel wants to push them to Egypt. The Egyptians don't want them. So I'm thinking ideally the world that has money, which partly means the Arab world and partly means the West. And the question is whether these people will be allowed to rebuild and stay there, or whether in fact Israel will have its will, which is to repatriate them, because Israel really wants them out of the country. It is a continuation of the Nakba. But the question is, who is going to dish out the money, and in what way? And it's not like the poor Palestinians have much choice in the matter at this point. It's a matter of charity that somebody will say, okay, or not even charity, but just to avoid regional war as well, that somebody will come in and say, well, we have to do this, that, and the other. And whatever will be done will probably be inadequate, but will save lives. I mean, right now they aren't even getting enough food or water. So, that's, a lot has to be done, and some countries have the money.
Yes, I wanted, before we end, I know someone said they had their hand up, but if we don't see it on the automatic thing, I don't see it. There are too many people to be panning all the time to look and see a physical hand up. You have to be able to use the automatic one on the screen. So I want to mention before we finish, again, Linda's book, Tracing Homelands, which John has put all the information of where to order it on in the chat log. And it's, to me, what's incredible about this book, I mean, there are many things that are, but it's Linda's journey through how she learned from the early propaganda to eventually questioning it, to kind of looking at that, relearning, and constantly re-looking at the situation. And this is what praxis is about. I was telling her early, it's the relearning that we all have to do as we grow up and grow older. That's part of our lifelong education. So I want to thank you so much, Linda, for sharing your wisdom with us today. It's really been extraordinary. And it's been wonderful sharing this time with you. And I want to talk to you again after this. But
I want to thank everybody for coming and for your questions and your hesitations as well. This is a complicated issue. So I really thank you very much for being here.
thank you again, Linda. And I know sometimes people like to hang out for a little while afterwards. I'm going to stop the recording now.